Somaliland is in the news. So if you don't know much about Somaliland, now is the time for you to learn that Somaliland is a functioning, independent republic on the Horn of Africa. It's Muslim, pro-peace, pro-stability, and anti-Islamist. One nation has now officially recognized Somaliland as a sovereign state. That nation, in case you haven't guessed, is Israel. Now, that's infuriated neighboring Somalia, which is a hotbed of al-Shabaab, an armed Islamist and jihadi group that pledged allegiance to al-Qaeda. Egypt, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Djibouti, and Nigeria also are furious over Israel's recognition of Somaliland. And British Prime Minister Keir Starmer doesn't think the people of Somaliland and their democratically elected government have the right to decide their own future. On what basis? His Majesty's government says they care about the territorial integrity of Somalia. But Somaliland has been detached from Somalia for 34 years. Okay, one more data point. The leaders and people of Somaliland want to join the Abraham Accords, the agreements brokered by President Trump that are establishing peaceful and cooperative relations between Israel and several of its Arab and Muslim neighbors. Lots to unpack here. To help us do that is Bashir Goth, Somaliland's representative in the United States, hopefully soon to be Somaliland's ambassador to the United States. He's also a longtime journalist and translator. With us as well as Michael Rubin, a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute and director of policy analysis at the Middle East Forum. Michael began visiting Somaliland years ago. He and Bashir have even invited me to tag along. I clearly erred by not taking them up on their offer. But you know how it is. You may even know how I am, or at least who I am. In case you don't, I'm Cliff May, and I'm glad you're joining us too here on Foreign Policy. Well, welcome, Bashir, and welcome, Michael. Good to see you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Clay. Thank you.
You know, I want to start by talking just a little bit about the Horn of Africa, because it's a special place. I know because years ago I spent a fair amount of time reporting from Ethiopia, which borders Somalia and Somaliland, and which has provinces, and particularly the Ogaden, which are populated by ethnic Somalis. Maybe start, Michael, just with a few sentences about the Horn of Africa and why it's special in terms of its relations. Well, it's part of Africa and kind of part of the Middle East too. Am I wrong in that?
You're absolutely right, Cliff. The Horn of Africa has always been attached economically, commercially, culturally to the Middle East and to Africa. It really is a crossroads, but that shouldn't surprise given its adjacency to primary trade routes throughout the region. If you look at the Somali flag, many people know the pale blue background with the white five-pointed star. That five-pointed star represents the 5 parts of Greater Somalia, which is Somalia as we know today, Somaliland, the Ogaden in Ethiopia, which you mentioned, Djibouti, which is largely ethnically Somali, as well as the northeast province of Kenya as well. And so what we're really talking about is a region in flux, a region that, not unlike in the 1950s and 1960s, is beset by a destabilizing ethnic nationalism. Back in the day, it was Gamal Abdel Nasser and Arab nationalism. In the Horn of Africa today, it's Somali nationalism. But Somaliland and Somalia have always had their own distinct histories, going back not only to the Cold War, but before to the British colonial period when Djibouti was French, British Somaliland, what we call Somaliland today, was a British protectorate, and the rest of Somalia was controlled by the Italians.
Right. And Bashir, doing even a little more history, if you go way back, the regions of Somalia were not under foreign empires like the Ottoman Empire. They were sultanates, I guess, until the time when, as Michael's saying, you had the British Empire, the French Empire, the Italian Empire taking control of various parts of Somalia, and Ethiopia, again, holding. I mean, the reason it's the shape it is not because Somalis hug the coast, but because if ethnic Somali territories were all together, it would be the whole kind of eastern section of Ethiopia plus the Red Sea coast. Do I have that right?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, the history of the Somali people, Somali region, goes back to ancient history, up to the pharaohs and the Chinese civilization. They were trading with the Somali people, especially if you look at the ports of Zaila and Berbera in Somaliland. They have a long history, and there have been sultanates, as you rightly mentioned it. But then when we come back from that, then for example, in the Somaliland area. It was the Ottoman Empire which came to Somaliland earlier than the British, and the Egyptians were ruling the Somaliland people by proxy under the Ottoman Empire. Then came the British and the other European powers like Michael has rightly said. For example, Djibouti came at the French. It was called French Somali Coast. Somaliland came under British, was Somaliland Protectorate, and Somalia Italiana on the other side. That was called Somalia South. And then the two regions of the Somali region in Ethiopia, we don't usually call Ogaden. That is a kind of a colonial name because it's only one clan out of many clans living in the Somali region of Ethiopia has taken that name. It was a Haile Selassie kind of, who labeled that region in order to just remove the word Somali from the region. But it's a Somali region. And then in Kenya, it was the Northern Frontier District, or what was called at that time NFD, which was the Somali region also. So yeah, that was the colonial part. Then that was the colonial part, yes.
So Michael, okay, so colonialism ends around 1960. Tell what happens then.
Okay, this is the key issue, Cliff, and I'm glad you asked it. On June 26, 1960, the British gave British Somaliland its independence. It was recognized by all 5 members of the UN Security Council at the time, as well as about 25 other countries. So when Somaliland became independent, it had borders that had been defined for almost a century by the British Protectorate, by treaties with neighbors, and so forth. This isn't analogous to the Kurds or to the Palestinians, who have never had their own state. We're talking about a reemergence of an independent state. And basically, what happened is Somaliland was independent for 5 days. On July 1st, 1960, the Italian part of Somaliland got its independence, and the British Somaliland officials made a controversial decision to join and merge with Italian Somaliland to form the Somali Republic, or what became Somalia. Now, there's a lot of controversy over what happened, not only because of the poor marriage in hindsight, but it was actually never ratified by the parliaments and so forth. So there's a question about the legality. The point of this, however, is in 1991, when Somalia descended into state failure, and we all remember Black Hawk Down, that era and so forth, Somaliland decided, none of this. We're done with this marriage. We're going to reassert our independence, and they've governed themselves for far longer than they were ever part of Somalia. Now, the other key point that needs to be recognized is the Cold War dynamics. There's a dictator in Somalia during the Cold War named Mohammed Siad Barre. At first, he was a Soviet puppet. Then, this is a really strange aspect of Cold War history, but the Horn of Africa flipped, where Ethiopia went from being an American ally to a Soviet ally. Somalia went from being a Soviet ally to an American ally. The Berbera airstrip, which we hear so much about, was actually a NASA Space Shuttle emergency landing strip, in theory. The point of this, however, is this dictator, Siad Barre, decided to wage a campaign of genocide against the clan, which is predominant in Somaliland. So you're not just talking about a state that decided they no longer wanted to be part of this marriage. You're talking about a state that was subject to a genocide in which hundreds of thousands of people were killed, in which 80% of the capital city was destroyed by mercenaries and so forth. And so, the analogy I use would be saying that Somaliland has to be part of Somalia is like telling the Rwandans, the Tutsi-dominated Rwandans, they have to bring back the Hutu genocidaire to let them rule, because what happened in 1994 wasn't legitimate. It makes no sense. It's immoral. But of course, there's also a strategic aspect of this, which is front and center today.
Okay, so a couple of things. One is that that genocide that was waged against the clan that's predominant in Somaliland, only one nation tried to bring that to the attention of the UN and the international community. And again, guess which nation that was? It was Israel, but no one wanted to pay attention. Again, you guys can correct me if you think I'm wrong on any of this. Maybe start with that. That is correct? That back then?
Bashir is a survivor of this, so I defer the floor to him.
Yeah, that's correct. That's correct. And 35 years now, coming May, we will be celebrating the 35th anniversary of Somaliland restoration of independence. Usually the media wrongly characterizes Somaliland independence as, for example, breakaway region or secessionist region, which is not. As Michael has actually presented, Somaliland was an independent country in 1960. It was one of the African countries that became independent in 1960 and was recognized by almost 30 countries before it did that wrong marriage or merge with Somalia. And then if I go back a little to that, the Somaliland people were immediately disappointed with the union, with that kind of merger. And the reason is immediately they got marginalized. And the Somaliland military officers that was left by the British in Somaliland, when they realized that this was a wrong marriage, they tried to make a coup d'etat and reclaim Somaliland independence again. It failed. It was aborted. And then the military officers were court-martialed in Mogadishu, the capital. The Somalilanders have hired a British lawyer for them, and this is what I'm coming to. And then when the case went on, the trial went on, the British lawyer came to the conclusion that because they were accused of national treason. And at the end of the day, the lawyer said there's no basis for this case because they did not commit national treason because the union was never ratified, and he proved that, and they were released.
Right.
So that shows that union has never happened. Then in that year, in 1961, there was a referendum for the country's constitution, for the Somali Republic. And then almost the Somaliland people rejected that with 90%, overwhelmingly, they rejected that. Nobody listened to that because the other side was more populous and it has taken the day. Then let's come now to 1991, when the central government collapsed and, the brutality and the atrocities that Michael has, rightfully presented happened. Somaliland people came together and they said, you know what? No more. No more union, no more problems, no more wrong, bad marriage. Let us reclaim our independence. And then in 1991, Somalilanders have reclaimed their independence for now 35 years. All these 35 years, we have been knocking doors all over the world. The African countries, the Arab world, the Muslim world, Europeans, everywhere. And nobody opened the door for us. Everybody turned a blind eye to Somaliland. Not even a sympathy, not even listening to us, not even taking our case for discussion in the African Union or the Arab League. And then it is Israel which has come now on board and said, what? We are going to break the glass ceiling. And then everybody's angry. Why? I don't understand.
Hey, Cliff.
Yeah, Michael.
Cliff,
yeah.
If I can just insert for a second. I'm a historian, so I'm paid to predict the past. And my detractors might say that I get that right only about half the time. But I think when we're talking about what happened in Somalia and Somaliland with the dissolution of the Union, it's important to point out that there's other precedents here. We all remember between 1958 and 1971, Egypt and Syria merged into the so-called United Arab Republic. And then they dissolved. And many of the countries which are now condemning the recognition of Somaliland recognize Egypt and Syria. In fact, Egypt itself condemned this, and they're being hypocritical here. Also in 1982, also in Africa, you had a union between Senegal and Gambia, the Senegambia Confederation. That too didn't work out. And in 1991, they reverted back to their constituent parts, Senegal and Gambia. And again, I checked yesterday, most of the countries that are objecting to Somaliland's independence have indeed recognized both Senegal and Gambia and aren't trying to keep them in the Senegambia Confederation. So there's a lot of hypocrisy on the world stage, even as people talk about rule of law.
Yeah, and the idea of territorial integrity. I think you point this out in a Middle East Observer article. There was once a country called Yugoslavia. It's now several different countries. There was a Soviet Union. Well, Putin is trying to restore it by forcing Ukraine back under the rule of the Kremlin. But it was dissolved. That's okay. There was a country called Czechoslovakia. They decided the Czechs and the Slovaks, close as they are, they wanted their own countries. It was kind of an amicable divorce. This kind of thing happens all the time, and there's no hue and cry from the UN and the international community about territorial integrity. People have a right, especially when you're talking about people who in Somaliland, it seems to me, have established a democracy, which as opposed to Somalia, which has not established democracy. And by the way, we should just point out this, as I understand it, Bashir, Somaliland has been very sick without getting aid, as they had huge amounts of aid flowing into Gaza and Judea and Samaria, the West Bank, all kind. You got no aid, but you established a functioning economy as well as a functioning polity. I've got that right too, haven't I?
Yeah, you got that right. Very, very right. And let me add to the examples you gave earlier. Also, for example, in 1971, December 6th, India unilaterally recognized Bangladesh.
Right.
And nobody made an outrage. And Bangladesh came out of a war that time. Actually, that's the day the war stopped between Bangladesh, which was eastern Pakistan, and the rest of Pakistan. There was no government in Bangladesh like the way it's Somaliland now. And nobody make an outrage. And that shows the hypocrisy of the word in the United Nations also. Yes, Somaliland. We didn't have access to international financial institutions because we were not recognized. So what we did is we have to rely on ourselves. We have to rely on our own resources, on our own income, on our own taxation. We built on our own institutions. So the country has been built by its own people, by its own bootstraps, as the Americans say. Yes, and that should be a model for Africa. Michael has written a lot about that. But if I give you another example, there is a professor in the University of Chicago called James Robinson, and he co-authored a book called Why Nations Fail, and last year they got the Nobel Prize for Economy. He has written actually about the case of Somaliland when he was presenting when he was receiving the Nobel Prize in Oslo, and he was presenting his case. He actually took Somaliland as an example and said, wait a minute, if African countries, when they became 1960 independent, if they just behaved like Somaliland and they didn't take any foreign aid and they relied on themselves, what would have been the African continent? And that's what Somaliland is, actually a role model for that. But instead of appreciating that, and instead of rewarding that, the international community is rewarding a failed state that is, infested with terrorism. And it actually defies the logic.
Cliff, if I could actually just insert for a second. We've referred to Somaliland as a democracy, and it's easy for all sorts of countries to call themselves a democracy. But for an audience that may not be familiar with Somaliland, it's important to recognize that the United States has provided Somalia proper with about $2 billion in order to stage one-man, one-vote elections. And Somalia has never been able to do it. When we talk about the government of Somalia, they select 400 people arbitrarily. I mean, clan leaders, politicians, and so forth. And then those 400 will elect a government. In Somaliland, there's been 10 different elections. Now, one of the things that really struck me as an outsider coming is one of these elections, with more than 1 million votes cast, was decided by less than 100 votes. And it led to a transfer of government that was completely peaceful. In fact, all of Somaliland's elections have led to transfers of power, completely peaceful. But the other thing that really struck me, for all we're providing assistance to other countries which are incapable or disinterested in creating democracy, Somaliland contracted to become the first country in the world to secure voter identification with biometric iris scans. We still have disputes in the United States about whether you can show a driver's license, but Somaliland's elections are perhaps the most secure in the world because of this. And this is also one of the reasons why there hasn't been disputes when, as in the last election, the incumbent is ousted and a new party leader takes his place.
For those who also remember piracy coming out of this area, and I remember writing about this and reading about this, and there's some books on this, it was coming out of what is now what we call Somalia, not out of Somaliland. The Somaliland has patrolled its coasts and prevented that kind of piracy. That's a great achievement, because I remember a time people saying, I don't know how we stop piracy. I don't know how it can be done.
Somaliland actually imprisoned the pirates, as Bashir can say.
Yeah, we have a small coast guard that actually protects our coastline, and we never experienced piracy because our small coast guard was protecting Somaliland waters, and we prevented terrorism from the country. We had only one attack of terrorism in 2008, and that's all. Because the Somaliland people, we actually rely on human intelligence, as Michael has seen many times, human intel. So, for example, if today a new person comes and rents a house next in any area in Hargeisa, for example, in any other city, if the people don't know, the families, the neighboring families will just call the police and say, there is somebody we don't know, maybe you have to check. And that's how the human intelligence works in Somaliland. And we have no terrorism, actually. And, we have fulfilled all the requirements of statehood according to the Montevideo, Convention. But then the world doesn't listen to all these values of democracy and elections and free market economy and free price and all these things. No, I mean, they preach all these things as a lip service, but when it comes to reality, then we see how they deal with, for example, Somaliland.
Now, Somaliland has been essentially independent, developing an economy, developing its political system over the past 34 years. Michael, why now has Israel decided, okay, we're going to recognize the sovereignty, we're going to take the lashings, the tongue lashings that have come from the UN and other places for this? Why did they decide to do this?
Well, I mean, first of all, I'm not Israeli, and ultimately the Israelis will need to explain that decision on their own. That said, you've got a situation where a lot of people saw this coming. They just didn't know who the first country would be. The Ethiopians, of course, the largest neighbor to Somaliland, regularly recognize or receive the Somaliland president equal to other heads of state in meetings in Addis Ababa. And the Ethiopians always used to joke that they wouldn't be the first country to recognize Somaliland, but they're not going to be the third country either. And there's a lot of other countries in that sort of category. When you actually drive around the streets of Hargeisa, you see consulates for Turkey, offices for Denmark, for Djibouti, for Kenya, for the United Kingdom, and so forth. I mean, one of the big discussions ongoing in the State Department, even before Israel's actions, was whether the United States would establish a consulate in Hargeisa or an office more modeled after what we operate in Taiwan. And of course, the Taiwanese have also established relations with Somaliland, so let's not forget that. But then, look, there's also a strategic angle, and it would be disingenuous to ignore it. Somaliland has a 528-mile coastline along the Gulf of Aden. And of course, what's across from the Gulf of Aden? You have the Houthis, you have Yemen, and so forth. And you have Somalia on one side, and you mentioned Puntland, where the piracy was, which has an Islamic State problem. Somalia proper has a al-Shabaab problem, which is an al-Qaeda affiliate. You have Djibouti, which has a China problem. I mean, it's basically a satrapy of China today. And so you have this area, which is not only democratic, but it's secure. It stopped the weapons trafficking between Somalia and Yemen. For those who prioritize the environment, it's the leader in Africa on countering the illegal wildlife trade, the cheetah trade, the falcon trade, and so forth. And so, again, you have a country doing everything right. And the final point here, and I mentioned this before, is you have Berbera. According to the World Bank, Berbera is the top sub-Saharan African port now, which is astounding considering that Somaliland is unrecognized, but so many commercial companies actually trust the Somaliland government because of rule of law, that the Somaliland port in Berbera has surpassed Djibouti. It's surpassed Mombasa in Kenya. Right adjacent to the port is this airport, which was renovated by the United Arab Emirates. It has, until recently, the second largest airstrip in Africa. I think there's a couple countries which have now surpassed it. This is where the United States during the Cold War used to base its forces. So, Cliff, I used to teach on American aircraft carriers. And when we would have aircraft carriers patrol the Red Sea, it takes 4,000 to 5,000 men to crew a Nimitz-class aircraft carrier. If we fly Ospreys, those planes that take off as helicopters and then transform into planes, it only takes 4 or 5 people to transform to crew them, and they go much faster than the aircraft carriers. And so if there is a base in Berbera for freedom of navigation operations, for counterterrorism operations, it really is, there's seldom a solution in international relations, which is what's the word? It's so perfect in all of its, so elegant in all of its solutions. But this is one of those, which is why perhaps the Israelis recognize what the Americans would.
So if you or I were advising President Trump right now, would we not say, look, it's in the U.S. interest to recognize Somaliland? One, it wants to join your Abraham Accords. It wants to contribute to that. Two, it's right across from where the Houthis are. If you want somebody to fight the Houthis, you don't want America to have to do too much. You might be able to get the Israelis to do that without having to fly thousands of miles away and bomb tunnels and mountains. Maybe it could be done from there, because the Houthis, after all, they are violating basic international law that America has always guaranteed, which is freedom of the seas, by stopping commercial shipping, by bombing, rocketing commercial shipping in the Red Sea and the Bab el-Mandeb, the kind of that tight strait between those two. From the strict point of view of American national interest, not to mention values, which also come in, America should be recognizing Somaliland and welcoming Bashir as the ambassador.
You're very right, actually. And if you look at it, anyway, in the Congress they always call me the ambassador, so I now accept it.
Your Excellency, I will call you Your Excellency.
Yeah, thank you. There's a great power competition going on in the Horn of Africa now. I remember one time reading a long time ago a book about Africa, and the writer characterized that Somali region in the Horn of Africa as the cockpit of the world. So that was during the Cold War, and still it's the cockpit of the world. It's a very critical region, very strategically very, very important, as you can see, where 30% of world trade passes through the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden. So now, as you know, there's a great power competition there. There are the Turkey, who really want to recreate and revive the Ottoman Empire in the region. And they almost own Somalia. Everything they own in Somalia, all the resources. And they have the biggest military base in the world. They have in Mogadishu. Recently they have even built a base for where they can launch satellites and missiles and things like that. So they own the place and they own all the resources. They want to dominate the whole region. That's one thing. China is also another one which wants to dominate the whole region, and they are present in Somalia, Djibouti, and Ethiopia, and Kenya, and everywhere, except Somaliland. So Somaliland is the only country that's actually countering all these influences, whether it's Turkey, whether it's Chinese. So America is only present in partially. They have a base in Djibouti, and that's the only place, and that place is very, very, very contrasted. There are so many other countries who have a base in that place, and the Chinese dominate the place, and they have also commercial ports in Djibouti. Somaliland has Berbera, which has been expanded by DP World of Dubai and made it a maritime hub for Africa. And you have Ethiopia with 110 million people, which will be the market for that port. So it is really natural. And even now, there's a new addition now. Egypt has also come to Djibouti and is building a port in Djibouti and ports in Assab of Eritrea. So it's only natural for Israel to be part of this. it's as a middle power or even a big power, Israel has to actually, they have the right to also look after their interest in the region, because the Red Sea is an economic artery for the whole region.
Quick points, I want you to comment on.
I'm not talking for Israel, but for Somaliland. So, if the interest is, in align, and we were looking for recognition for a long time, and Israel has come on board and said, you know what, we are going to recognize you. How can Somaliland people say no to that? This is what we were looking at all over the last 35 years, and nobody was listening to us. And like Michael said, every country we go to, we're telling us we will be the second country. We will not be the first. Now we have the first. Okay, the bet is who will be the second.
Michael, 2 quick points. One is also Eritrea left Ethiopia. Nobody complained about the territorial integrity of Ethiopia there, even though it left Ethiopia landlocked, which I never thought the Ethiopians would allow Eritrea to break off that way and leave them landlocked, but they did. 2, Bashir mentions that there's a U.S. base in Djibouti as well as a Chinese base. You'll know this. I'm just guessing that at this point, the U.S. base is dwarfed by the Chinese base and by Chinese influence, and it's probably a danger in having a U.S. base that close to a larger Chinese base, no?
You're absolutely right, Cliff. First, great point with regard to Eritrea. I would just add that the United States supported the secession of South Sudan from Sudan. The difference between Eritrea and South Sudan and Somaliland is Somaliland has capacity. It's not going to launch to become a failed state because it's already been operating for 30 some odd years as a functioning independent state. But you're absolutely right to bring up the case of Djibouti. According to, your audience knows that whenever the United States has military in a country, we have something called a status of forces agreement, oftentimes referred to in the acronym obsessed Pentagon as a SOFA. With regard to our status of forces agreement in Djibouti, it says that the Djiboutians need to be the sole air traffic controllers, which has become an increasing problem for our military aircraft because the Djiboutians aren't always the most competent, especially after 4 p.m. when they're chewing pot, which, as you know, is it's not a narcotic, but it's a cultural stimulant. Which is deemed illegal in the United States. Regardless, we've had incidents with our U.S. naval aviation in which our pilots landing in Djibouti have been blinded by Chinese lasers fired from the Chinese base just about 4 miles away. And so you're absolutely right. Berbera has space around it. And therefore, you wouldn't have this problem. The other important thing is it's outside the strategic choke point of the Bab al-Manda. The other point I just want to make, in response to your initial question, is, Donald Trump may not have studied this, but I'm sure behind the scenes he's asking his advisors now. And what he's going to find is most of his advisors support Somaliland independence. In 2023, largely through the good efforts of Bashir, the National Defense Authorization Act included a mandate by which the U.S. government was it was made mandatory for the State Department to study Somaliland independence and what the United States' position towards Somaliland would be. And the reason for that is the Pentagon wants Somaliland independence, the Central Intelligence Agency wants Somaliland independence, the FBI supports Somaliland independence because they've used Somaliland's good offices in order to help flesh out some investigations and so forth. The State Department has been dragging its feet simply because the State Department has traditionally wanted to prioritize good relations with Mogadishu. When you're a U.S. ambassador, there's 2 types of U.S. ambassadors broadly. Those who will stand up for U.S. interests no matter what tension they cause in the region, and those ambassadors who think that if they only ingratiate themselves enough to the ruling leader, that those good relations equal good relations between our states. We all remember Frank Ricciardoni back in 2005, who famously told a group at, I think, University of Cairo, that Hosni Mubarak was so popular that he could even win elections in the United States. This is shortly before the Arab Spring. That's not the type of ambassador we need. Unfortunately, for too long, that's been the type of ambassador we have in Mogadishu. And so what we've seen is Congress, Ted Cruz especially, stepping up to try to force the State Department to change, to basically break out of this inertia and recognize what a strategic coup it would be to re-recognize Somaliland.
Right. While we're talking about Trump, one more thing you've written about this, Michael, I believe, and that is Ilhan Omar. Ilhan Omar is a thorn in the president's side, and it should be a thorn in everybody's side. Bashir, I may get this wrong, so you help me with this. But most of the people in Somaliland are from the Isaac clan, and they were the ones who were the targets of the genocide by the dictator Siad Barre. He's from, I believe, the Darad clan. And I believe Ilhan Omar is too, in that her father was part of that, was a general who took part of that genocide. Am I oversimplifying, or am I getting that wrong?
Yeah, I think you're right. I think I would leave that for Michael to actually to elaborate. But one thing I can say about Ilhan Omar is that she is deadly against Somaliland, and she campaigned in the Congress, and she was in the Foreign Relations Committee of the House, and she was against Somaliland. But the rest, I will just let Michael, elaborate.
Suffice to say that Ilhan Omar supposedly had her family comes from the Puntland area where the piracy was. It's from a different clan. But what really strikes me is when Ilhan Omar has gone back to talk to Somali audiences, including in Somalia, she often talks about Somalia as her home country and not the United States when she's speaking in Somali to, for lack of a better words, her constituents back in Somalia itself. Which raises questions whether she's trying to transport the dysfunctional Somali worldview into U.S. foreign policy. But, I don't see Ilhan Omar as the biggest problem here for the United States. Donald Trump has defined his presidency, both the first and perhaps even the second, standing up to China, recognizing malign Chinese influences. I would argue that during the first Trump term, whether you're pro-Trump or anti-Trump, whether you're Republican or Democrat, one thing which analysts and historians can agree on is that is when the debate about China's intentions ended, and both Democrats and Republicans recognize that the People's Republic of China isn't just a competitor or isn't a partner, but it's a competitor and a malign one at that. We need to recognize that Somaliland has allied itself with Taiwan, one of only two African countries to do so. While just a week ago, before Israel's recognition of Somaliland, the president of Somalia, Hassan Sheikh Mohamud, gave a full-throated endorsement to a Chinese invasion of Taiwan on Chinese television. And this is the man whom we're siding with? I think Donald Trump needs to call Marco Rubio and Chris Landau. And from what I hear from inside the State Department, the problem is actually with Deputy Secretary of State Chris Landau, and basically say, look, this nonsense needs to stop. We are going to support the country that opposes communist China, not support the country that ingratiates itself to it.
Also, Taiwan is independent. De facto, if not de jure. Also, it's, it hasn't been part of China since the Ming Dynasty, I believe. I mean, people of Taiwan do not want to be ruled by the Communist Party of China and Xi Jinping. They want to be allied with America. They want to be free and prosperous. The same you can say about Somaliland. And yet, dictators who dominate the UN, they want to say, no, we shouldn't be going along with them. By the way, the new national security strategy is not as good, in my view, on recognizing China for the adversary it is, rather than a competitor.
A quick tangent, Cliff, but did I ever tell you how I got myself banned and sanctioned in China?
No, do tell.
In 1936, and this as a former journalist, there's an American hagiographer named Edgar Snow.
Oh, I remember Edgar. Yes.
Walter Durante.
Yeah.
And I dug up, and I can provide this to you, an Edgar Snow interview with Mao Zedong, in which Mao Zedong said, our first item on our agenda has to be to push the Japanese out of China. And then we can continue and push the Japanese out of Chosin, which was the name of Korea at the time, and Formosa, which was the name of Taiwan at the time. And then Mao Zedong told Edgar Snow in 1936, and then both Korea and Taiwan can become independent. That's not necessarily the narrative that the communist Chinese today want, but it's something that Mao Zedong actually said. And the point here when it comes to Somaliland is too often in the United States, and I would say increasingly in Europe, our sense of history is only 4 or 8 years long. And when a new administration comes into power, we think that we can have a tabula rasa. But history is actually longer. And simply repeating a falsehood or spin doesn't actually make it true. You're absolutely right that over the past 500 years, mainland China has only controlled Taiwan for about 27 years because the Qing dynasty wasn't even considered Chinese.
Manchu, right?
It was considered
Manchurian.
Mongol.
Yeah.
Now, when it comes to Somaliland, Somaliland too has always been separate from Somalia. And this notion that they need to be forced into an unhappy marriage is actually based on a false reading of history.
All right. What else do we need to discuss so that people understand this situation? Anything we've left out in this conversation that you want to add in?
Yeah, one thing probably talking about Taiwan, which has, Taiwan and Somaliland have established diplomatic relations. I think now it's more than 5 years. And China has been trying to do everything they can to frustrate Somaliland, to push Taiwan out of Somaliland. And as you know, Somaliland is the only second country that has diplomatic relations with Taiwan. The other one is Eswatini. So China is trying to put pressure, diplomatic pressure, economic pressure, sometimes even trying to create insurgents against Somaliland so that Somaliland can expel the Taiwanese from its country. But Somaliland is standing, and they said no. So I think that calls for a question where the Western countries, including the United States, stand on the issue of Taiwan and democracy and freedom all over the world. So if Somaliland is standing alone in that region and countering the Chinese influence and countering the creation of a new Ottoman Empire, okay, and nobody is just coming to its help or rescue, then it would be really a very, 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 very very weird world in which we live. So for Israel to come out of that as a free country, a democratic country, and say, you know what, this country has been doing well. It's a success story. It's a reality on the ground. It's a country that fulfilled all the statehood requirements. So why not? And our interests align. And they came to recognize Somaliland. I think that's a very wise decision, which many countries has to follow.
And I'm just going to conclude, Cliff, with 2 quick points. Please. Number one, a few years ago, I brought my then 9-year-old daughter to Somaliland. And we went from Hargeisa to Berber. You've probably seen some of those pictures. We didn't have security. We walked around in the capital. This isn't the Somalia which many people think about. It's a perfectly safe, secure place. I mean, it's famous for in the markets, people will go for their siesta and leave big bundles of cash sitting out because they know no one is going to touch them. That's number one. Number two, while the economy of Somaliland has traditionally revolved around livestock, the fact of the matter is Somaliland has transformed its economy from 1991 to the present, where it's become a little Silicon Valley.
Really?
In the Horn of Africa, where I've walked through the streets of Hargeisa, and many of the roads are unpaved in Hargeisa. In Berbera, it's much more modern. But you go into, for example, the headquarters of Somtel, or Telesom, I'm sorry, which is a multi-billion-dollar phone and mobile money business, and it's like walking into a NASA control room. Coca-Cola has the second largest bottling plant in Africa, because again, this is a country that, despite its lack of recognition, has made all the right choices and has cultivated an atmosphere where business and industry and tech can thrive. Famously, we have Venmo and Zelle and so forth in the United States, but they haven't really caught on the way they have in Africa. But when you look at the Habsburg and some of the other mobile money companies, which are Somaliland based, the fact of the matter is Somaliland has 99% penetration by mobile money, to the point where I once saw a beggar on one of my trips in front of a mosque saying basically the equivalent of, please, sir, can I have some change? Here is my mobile money account to donate money into. And the fact of the matter is, it really is an amazing society. It's not only a lesson, I mean, the United States, I would argue, needs to support it because it's important to support the countries that are doing everything right, rather than those like Kurdistan, which is very corrupt, or Palestinian society, which hasn't forsworn terror. Somaliland has made all the right choices, but at the same time, it really is an example of how foreign aid can be corrupting, and how there's a moral hazard to dumping money on problems rather than allowing people to take responsibility and have agency to solve their own problems. Going back to your question about Donald Trump, this is really the chief selling point for me as an American. Somaliland shows that it affirms the attitude and the philosophy which Donald Trump and Secretary of State Marco Rubio have made with regard to foreign assistance. Foreign assistance should not simply be an entitlement. Foreign assistance should be something that's given in case of disaster, for example. But in a functioning society, those societies need to take charge of their own problems. And that really is the lesson of Somalia.
It's very simple. Who are our friends? Who are our partners? And who are simply dependents? And who are simply interested in undermining us? Who are our adversaries and who are our enemies? It's very dangerous to get confused about these things. And a foreign policy that's coherent understands these things and sees them through clear eyes, or so it seems to me. And I think it's very clear that Somaliland is a friend, a partner, and we should be recognizing it and working with the people of Somaliland to pursue common interests. We can leave it there. Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Bashir.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Happy New Year, everybody.